Hi everyone, in this video we are going to begin our switch over to C++. So we only have 2 days to look into C++, but we'll still start to learn some C++ syntax to set you up to program in C++ if you need it in another class or for a project. And also we will start to talk about the differences between procedural programming, which is what we've been doing, and object-oriented programming, which we can do in C++. So there are some slides here that I'll follow along and you can use as a resource later when you're developing your C++ programs. Hopefully they load. Okay. So to start off, we have lots of practice in C, so we can just think about how do we move from C to C++. So the first main difference that we're going to notice, even just in our Hello World program, is that instead of our #include stdio.h that we've been putting in every single one of our programs, we'll now include iostream, and we don't need that .h for this. And then we'll also put at the top of our programs this here that will allow us to use the std namespace. So to make this concrete, I'll open a C++, one of our Hello World programs in a minute, and we can see what that means. But basically, namespaces are this idea that allow us to group functions together nicely. And if we don't say this, we're going to have to say std : before we use something like cout or cin. So we've been using printf to print things to the console, and then we pass in our format string, but in C++ we're going to just say cout and use, I guess, less than, and then we can pass in our string that we want to print. And then to put a new line, we can either use the same new line character that we've been using, or within the std namespace, we have this end line, endl thing here, and when I program in C++, I always use this instead of the new line for whatever reason. So you can use either one, but you do have this end line here as well. So the compiler doesn't care what you name your files, but a convention is to use .cpp. That's what I use. You can use .c, .C, or just .cc. And then on our server, we have the G++ compiler. So instead of compiling with GCC, we will compile with G++, and we can use our same -o and -wal flags there. And we'll also see that we can use makefiles, and there's an example makefile available that I'll show during this video. So just further information on this namespace idea and our input and output. So let's just go ahead and take a look at some C++ code. So first I'm actually going to show you in the public directory. So there's been resources here that hopefully you've been using throughout the class. We know about the examples directory. Maybe I'm going to put my key casting on. Any last Vim keystrokes that you want to learn. And so here, these directories have been all the chapters of the book. But we don't have a book for C++, so there's just a C++ directory here, and then there are these different concepts that we're going to go over. So inside the intro directory, we have a bunch of examples, And the one I'm first going to look at is hello name. I already have that copied over into my home directory. And then, but you can copy these over and use them to start your programs or just run them to see what they do. We'll talk about some of them in the videos, but you can also explore on your own. There's also this generic makefile that you can use. So I think we'll come back to this potentially if there's no slide about it. But so I'm just in my home directory, and then I have a directory called class, and I already copied over this hello name.cpp, and I copied that generic makefile into a file called makefile, because if I want to run it using make, it has to either be makefile with a lowercase m or a capital M, I believe. So generic makefile wouldn't work. So if I run make, it's going to execute what's in my makefile, and this is saying that the compiler is G++. We're going to compile it into something called process. We want our executable is going to be called process. We want the -wall, and then there's some extra stuff in here as well. So let's look at hello name, because so what we want to look at here is, okay, so we've got this using namespace std for standard, I think, and here we're using a string, so we can see that already C++ is giving us something like a string. We don't have to make a char array. That's kind of nice. And so whereas before we might have said printf enter name, now all we do is we say put this enter name string into this cout stream, and that works. And then here cin is assigning whatever the user types to the variable name. So we can already see that C is kind of taking care of some of the things that we had to take care of as a programmer in C, right? We needed to say what type of, that it was going to be a type string that we were going to read into when we use scanf. So maybe and then also, okay, here, another thing to note here. So this is saying print hello, and then after that, if I want to sort of append print another thing, I just want to print out my variable name. That's what this is doing here, and then this is adding an end of line. And so if I run make, that would compile it. I could also do G++, G++ -o. If I wanted to call it process, let's see what happens if I do this. So this would be, if I didn't have a makefile, I just wanted to compile it this way, this would work as well. It's called hello name.cpp. And that just overwrote that executable, but now I could run it. And so, as promised, it prints enter name, and then that second cout call, we had hello, and then we had the whatever was stored in name, and then end of line. As we saw here, hello, the name, and then end of line. So it's just a different way of doing input and output that we're going to have to get used to. Okay. So one big change from C to C++ is that in C++ we can write object-oriented programs. So the big difference here is that we develop classes in object-oriented programming, So when we then instantiate a class, we call it an object. And these classes, they contain not just data, but also the procedures to manipulate that data within them. Whereas in C, or when we write procedural programming in any language, we have data, and then we can write functions that can take in that data and manipulate it, but the data and the functions are not wrapped up in one package. And so this is just another slide that's kind of saying the same thing. One thing to note in these slides is functional programming, or FP, is also referring to procedural programming. There's another programming paradigm called functional programming, but here this functional programming is referring to what I would call procedural programming, sort of where we don't have classes, like what we've been doing. So as an example, if we wanted to give everyone in an organization a raise, and we had designed our program to organize that information in an object-oriented way, we would have a class that represents an employee, and it might have attributes like name, ID, and salary, and then every employee would have a corresponding object, and then there would be a method associated to those the employee class that was something like increase salary, and maybe it would take in the amount that it was increased, and then that would update the data that was associated to that object. Whereas if we're approaching this from a procedural programming idea, then rather than having something that contained both the employee information and also the logic to manipulate the employee, we would have the data about the employees, and then we might have a function that just goes in and changes each one of the data for each one of those employees. So thinking about why we would be interested in learning C++, from my standpoint as a computer science researcher, I can tell you that in addition to all of these things here that are written in C++, I also know that a lot of computer graphics research, computer graphics tools are done in C++. Basically, anytime you want to go really fast, anytime you want a program to run really fast, C++ is kind of the go-to, at least in even in my field of computational biology, where we need really fast tools. C++ is definitely the go-to. So I would recommend, if you have a chance after this class to continue learning C++, definitely take it. Yeah. And so just like we've been learning in C, C++ allows us to have a lot of control over how we use the computer's resources. And so if, as a programmer, we want to have more control versus, say, something like Java, then C++ is going to be a great language. And here's a link to a resource for that. So just some additional information about object-oriented programming. I'm just going to make these slides available to you because we're actually not going to develop object-oriented programs ourselves in this class just because we don't have time. But I do want you to have this available if you're interested. So I think it is useful to strictly compare. If we say we wanted to write a program in C that allowed us to store and manipulate information about cars. So I would say the best that we can do in terms of organizing our program is to define a struct, maybe we call it car, and this groups together data about a car. But then when we want to manipulate a car or do something with the car, we would then need to define functions that take in the car variable, and then they can do whatever we need them to do. On the other hand, if we're in C++ and we get to define a car class, the car class will also have this data, but it will, rather than having to define functions outside of the car, we would define methods, and then we will call those methods. So something like myFord.start, rather than would be how that syntax might look in once we have a car object, which would be myFord would be a car object, versus here we have a function called start. This is in our C side. We would have a function called start that would take in a car variable of type struct. So there are some additional ideas in object-oriented programming that there are some slides going over, and I'm not going to go over those in the lecture because they are optional for this class. But the final slide here is just some things to watch out for as you are writing your first C++ programs. So we want to make sure we're using the G++ compiler, not GCC. You've typed GCC a million times by now, but you should use G++. So maybe a good way to remember this is just use the makefile. And then also make sure you got your greater than or less than signs the right way when you're doing cout and cin. And that is it for this first intro C++ video.